Ben Domenech, editor-at-large for The Spectator and a Fox News contributor. Ben, just real quickly, to kind of put this in context, the United States is in the top 3 nations that use cocaine the most in the world. The People's House is sacred ground in our democracy, so we hope. So there's a big picture and why it matters. Talk to me.
Well, I think that one of the things that we should understand about this is that, this is a security breach of the kind where, there are already, I think, in all likelihood, people who know who the culprit is within this White House. The fact that Karine Jean-Pierre would play so fast and loose with the facts when it comes to talking to the journalists in front of her is not a surprise. She's been, I think, an utter disaster as a communicator for this administration. She's used the invocation of the Hatch Act to try to dodge various questions and yet ended up violating it anyway. She's also someone who I think does not have the faith of a lot of the journalists who are asking questions of her that she's going to bring them an accurate assessment of what's going on. And the fact that she would just go out in front of them and say something so blatantly false. As soon as I heard her say it, by the way, it was one of those moments where I actually, yelled at the television saying, no, they weren't. They weren't gone yet. And everybody, I think, who pays attention knows that. So one of the questions, obviously, about this is, who did this? But the other question is, how does something like this happen without, greater awareness? Because if they come to us and say, oh, we don't know who did it. First off, I think Americans won't believe that because it's not very believable. But second, I think they should then ask, okay, if you can't figure this out in a place that's supposed to be as secure as, the most secure sort of place that we have in America, with the most important people at the head of our government involved there and just, steps away from where this happened, how can we have any confidence in your level of providing security for the first family and for the other people who work in that building every day? And look, as someone who did, walk through those halls and literally I've put my phone in the same cubby area where they found this to go into meetings and the like. It's something that's very disturbing to me that something like this could happen just a stone's throw from where, the president and the vice president work.
Yeah, getting that first person eyes on it as you're giving us right now is really helpful. I was going to add Congressman Drew, from the Republican from New Jersey, who was in Chad Pergram's reporting, pointed out, it isn't just that this is the most secure place on the planet, pretty much. It's that then there might be questions about what else is going on that we don't know about. Real quick thought on that, and we'll move forward.
Well, I just think that the congressman's point is taken, and it's one of these situations that I think becomes all the more concerning given the number of family members that are, reportedly essentially living at the White House or spending so much time there, they might as well be. Family members aren't subject to the same kind of testing that Jake Sullivan was talking about when it comes to drug use. And I think that that's a critical thing to remember as well. They don't have the same restrictions on them that staffers do have. And that's, something that becomes more concerning when there are a lot more people there than perhaps is intended or, is the norm when it comes to the number of people who live at the White House.
Well, look, we're going to segue right into Hunter Biden because it seems natural, because that's been part of the concern about him. Any sort of illicit drug use by anybody close to the president makes the situation vulnerable around the president, whether it's staff, it's family, friends, whatever. Republicans certainly are not going to let up when it comes to his son, Hunter. The first son's legal problems and personal issues already a hot topic for the 2024 race. GOP White House candidate Chris Christie on Hunter Biden's recent tax and gun probe plea deal.
Well, listen, U.S. Attorney Weiss has to explain himself, and he has to explain himself in public. The fact is that this investigation to Hunter Biden in Delaware is either a lie or it's incompetent. There's no way that it should take 5 years to get to a 2-count misdemeanor tax plea and then to dismiss the gun charges.
A new op-ed argues Biden's do the crime, but not the time. Former House Speaker Newt Gingrich did not hold back.
This is the most corrupt administration in American history, surrounded by people who live in a fantasy land in terms of how the world works. And the combination, I think, is an enormous danger to the very safety and survival of the United States.
Your response to that?
Well, first off, I think that former Governor Christie's point is a very important one. The idea that it would take 5 years to get to this type of result boggles the mind. And I don't think anyone who knows anything about the way these charges normally work views this as being normal. Instead, I think, especially given the whistleblowers' claims along these lines, we have to know whether Mr. Weiss was actually able to advance the kind of charges that he wanted to bring in other jurisdictions, as opposed to being, as they report, blocked in a number of different respects from going after the meatiest parts of what they had on Hunter Biden. I think the second question here is what level of corruption continues to this day. It's one thing to kind of say, we're going to sweep all this under the rug. And when we put Hunter out there at state dinners or during 4th of July celebrations, that's just normal and you just have to accept it. That seems to be the attitude of the Bidens and their family. I think that's a political mistake. But the bigger question is, look, he is not that long removed from doing and promising things to foreign entities, including America's adversaries, getting millions of dollars from them and then dispersing that money through a network of LLCs to members of his family. That stinks to high heaven. It looks as if this is an act of serious, ethical breach and corruption. And whether he actually delivered on those promises or not is something that remains unclear. Until we can have clarity on that point, these questions are still going to be asked, and the suspicions that the former speaker has about the level of corruption that could still be going on are certainly not allayed by any of the attitudes of the people at the White House, who seem to just act as if this is something that can be easily dismissed.
Well, and you are so right. I mean, with the chilling and the blocking potentially of, the questions within the investigation and the actions within the investigation, it is problematic that Hunter Biden would be around leaders of foreign countries, given all that you just said continuously. Ben, it's always good to have you kick us off here on The Focus. Thank you very much, Ben Domenech.
Great to be with you.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.